Horseshoe crabs facing extinction after 455 million years. Next on Environment Long Island. Welcome to Environment Long Island. I am Karl Grossman, and with me is a world expert on horseshoe crabs. Your concern, Dr. John Tanacredi, is the possibility of extinction of horseshoe crabs. Why?
Well, Carl, actually, if I could really answer that question, I'd be a Nobel laureate. I can tell you that never in human history, anyway, have these animals been in the dire straits that they're in. You are absolutely right. They are paleo survivors. They've been on Earth for over 450 million years. And they've survived 5 mass extinction events in Earth history. And so these animals were moving about under the legs of brontosauruses in the earliest parts of Earth history. And yet, with all of that, today their numbers are dwindling. Their numbers are critically impacted by human activity again. This is a major concern. There's a variety of things. I'll get into the details of some of those contributing factors into this PowerPoint presentation, but I think the most important thing here is that these animals have been sort of taken for granted a little bit. They have an amazing contribution to human health, which I'll go into more detail. And the idea of their specialized habitat, because they're only found on the east sides of the continents. There are only 4 species on Earth in the entire complexity of biodiversity on Earth. There are only 4 species. And the North American horseshoe crab, Limulus polyphemus, is an animal that we kind of poke fun at a little bit. The Telson, can it stab me? There were always these things growing up in Brooklyn. There were all kind of myths that were happening to me when I was a kid about these animals. But again, my first exposure to their biology and to studying them was at the New York Aquarium, basically under George Ruggieri, Dr. Ruggieri, and the director there. I was a high school docent and worked in the laboratory, and it followed up long term as to where these animals are found, and that is a critical part of their habitat. But I'll get into that detail once we get into the PowerPoint. Just as a preface to this, though, and the New York Times had a great little article recently talking about testing, dealing with the horseshoe crab blood, just to give you a little hint on that, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the idea of coming up with a treatment at some point in time for this, an inoculation that maybe can deal with this, need all of these testing protocols to get the proper response from the pharmacology here. It goes back to the horseshoe crab's production of what is called LAL, Limulus amebicide lysate, and that's an endotoxin detecting system that is really very incredibly difficult to reproduce synthetically, and that's become a big issue right now, because more and more of the new drugs that are going to be coming out to deal with the pandemic are going to have to be tested to make sure that there's no any side effects associated with detecting endotoxins, or basically the toxic responses from microbes. So I'm going to go into the slide presentation, if that's okay, and we'll transition.
Absolutely, and I neglected to mention that you're the director of the Center for Environmental Research and Coastal Oceans Monitoring at Molloy College, which is located in Rockville Center on Long Island.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. Yes, CIRCOM is the only captive breeding laboratory in the Western Hemisphere. I always would say the United States, but it's definitely in the Western Hemisphere. There's only 2 labs in the entire globe that captively breed horseshoe crabs to any extent. City University of Hong Kong produces about 70,000 juveniles a year, which they release out into Hong Kong Harbor. And at CIRCOM in West Sayville on Long Island, we produce about 10 to 20,000 juveniles each year, but we keep them in the laboratory because there's a story about that as well. Everything in horseshoe crabs has a little side story to it, but the idea of aquaculture for these organisms is not all that easy. Okay, so I'm clicking, I think I just have to click away here. So this presentation is not about dinosaurs, but now that I have your attention, or everyone's attention, this is an important thing here because primarily horseshoe crabs are paleo survivors. When you look in geological history, if you can see this down here, down through the Cambrian and the Ordovician ages of invertebrates, their ancient relatives are the New York State fossil Eurypterids and trilobites. And as a kid, I used to remember just looking at pictures and studies of these animals, and they were the predominant life form in the early oceans. They are not crabs, and there's always been a little bit of a debate of horseshoe crabs being incorporated into crustaceans as crustaceans, but they are basically in insected realm. You can see here the relationship to crustaceans. The horseshoe crabs are this group here, Chelicerae, which are basically animals like spiders and scorpions, but horseshoe crabs have their legs or their appendages surrounding their mouth parts. And as you can see here in geological time, since the Paleozoic, all trilobites are gone, extinct on the planet, but the crustaceans and the Chelicerae have survived. And again, they're part of the insect world, arachnids, so it's a very important part of their development. When you take a look at trilobites, a dear colleague of mine, Yumiko Iwasaki from Japan, has been doing work on the idea of trilobites because these are invertebrates. They basically crawl out of their shells and each over a certain period of time. These molts are very important. Actually, when you find results in the paleo record and you find it in fossilized records, it's usually molts that survive to some extent, though it's very difficult. It's much harder for invertebrates to produce fossils. But the study, here's some of the early forms that are the local cousins there on the bottom. Mesolimulus was the kind of the first, again, 445 million years ago. These go back 455 million years to these trilobites. And there's quite a big record of these early forms coming up to the horseshoe crabs. And that scientists, certainly ecologists and paleoecologists, believe that this life form hasn't been dramatically changed in that long period of time. Actually, when you take a look at the fossil, there's one at the American Museum of Natural History, and you take a look at the animal today, you really can't tell the difference between them. So it's that stasis, that ability to maintain what works, and they have not necessarily gone extinct in that time period, which makes it even more distressing when we look at how these animals are being treated today. This is a picture in actually the Delaware Bay area in the early turn of the century, in the early 19th century, actually, some part of the capture of close to 4 million animals were harvested to be ground up as fertilizer. So from a standpoint of how the Industrial Revolution basically helped with things, the removal of these animals as fertilizer has actually protected them in this particular case. The idea of harvesting them is still a concern today, not for fertilizer, that they've been substituted by chemical fertilizers, but they've been harvested for bait. Horseshoe crabs are collected in New York State alone. 135,000 each year for the last few years have been collected, but that number has been reduced considerably. There was a time when over 250,000 horseshoe crabs just on Long Island were harvested, cut up, and removed from the breeding population. So here is the first hint at what these particular animals, when you start to look at the details, the sociology, in ecology, is the idea of these animals not being able to be replaced by a synthetic bait for fishermen, and from the idea of where they get collected, and I'll get to that in a moment. But here is basically their habitat, the Long Island, that barrier beach, that fragile edge we call the South Shore of Long Island, is basically the embayments from Jamaica Bay all the way out to Peconic, and the North Shore certainly have habitats for horseshoe crabs. They each year, females come ashore first. They come onto the shoreline. You don't find them too much on the ocean beaches, though they do come in from the ocean, because these animals do go offshore in the wintertime into pretty deep waters in the Hudson Canyon. But we have no idea exactly where they all go. But they ultimately come back ashore starting in May, and they'll move to the same habitats that they've been going to for time immemorial. As a matter of fact, they have such tremendous site fidelity that you're not going to get animals repopulating places that are depleted in their supply by saying, well, maybe they can move from Long Island down to Florida. Somebody my age might be able to do it, but not their age. They're basically going to be coming back to the same beaches each year. And this is the type of habitat, coastal Spartina marsh habitats. We can tell when they're there when we see these tiny little divots in the sand. A female will put between 80 and 120,000 eggs in a season, usually 2 to 3 nesting sequences. Males come ashore soon after the females come on shore, and a single male will attach, it's called amplexus, will attach to the female and fertilize these eggs. And then another part of their paleo survival has to do with their reproductive strategy. It's not just one male and one female. There may be what they call satellite males, and there's a constant contribution to help increase genetic diversity there. So there'll be 3, 4, 5. I'll show you some pictures in a moment of males about a single female, a gravid female. But the coastline is changing, dramatically changing. It's not just the changing from natural phenomena, things that have to do overall with atmospheric temperatures, with water temperatures, but it has to do with structures. Here's a jetty, and you can't really get past this jetty if you're looking to get into a particular habitat. So these types of sites are constantly monitored. Looking at mud flats are very important. Here's an example of a single female with a host of males surrounding this female, contributing to, again, this diversity for the offspring. Here's a picture in Delaware Bay. Delaware Bay is the epicenter for horseshoe crabs in the United States, certainly. Their range is usually from somewhere in Maine, middle Maine, like basically from around Bar Harbor, a little north of that, down to the East Coast, around Florida, to almost Tallahassee. You can actually put a flag in the sand on the beach, and the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, east and west of that tip, you won't find horseshoe crabs breeding, but anywhere else they will. So there's this incredible site specificity and site ability to come back to it each year on their breeding cycle. Females coming ashore usually at a full moon, new moon, and a high tide. So there's, again, here's another adaptability. They're linked to the lunar cycle. They're linked to the idea of finding beaches due to their sensitivity. They have almost 10 different eyes on their primitive eyes called ocelli on their tail, on the what is called the prosoma, the outer portion of the animal. Again, these are invertebrates. So once they get to their terminal molt, they no longer grow. They are growing constantly. Females molt about 17 times in an 11-year cycle, and males about 16 times in that same 11-year cycle. So there's a difference there. The females are always larger than the males. It's called sexual dimorphism. And so there's a definite physiological response to the environment that's linked to the moon and to lunar cycles. And this is really important when we monitor these sites. Here's a pair in amplexus, and there's a small divot in which the animal may have just put eggs down. They're constantly moving in and out of the shore. They're constantly interacting. And here's a picture of a molt. Again, many people will see when they move along the shoreline, they'll see, oh, I saw tons of horseshoe crabs. They may have seen molts, or they may have seen dead horseshoe crabs. They may not have seen live ones. Because once they get caught up in the surf, they tend to turn over, and if they get caught there, birds will predate on them, or they'll dry out. Because these animals have what are called book gills, similar to the arachnids. If you turn this animal over, and we'll see some pictures in a moment, they look like leaves of pages in a book. And they're basically where they have oxygen exchange in their particular waters. So the animals come ashore in May. There you can see in this picture here to the back of the legs, all right, the pairs of legs. The book gills in these two animals, and there's tons of animals that attach to them. These are like slipper shells, or I've even seen algae growing on many of these, barnacles, what have you. A lot of encrusting animals once they become sexually mature. So once their molting cycle ends, then they're basically totally involved with the reproduction. And here is just a handful from one small nest, relatively small nest, of the numbers of eggs that are produced by horseshoe crabs. They take about 21 days for gestation, and they finally come up with, you see that little picture E and F there, called trilobite larvae. They look very much like trilobites. You see their compound eyes. They have two compound eyes. And then they have all of these primitive eyes called ocelli, and you'll see those periodically on the small juvenile or the larvae just as it hatches. So these animals, again, have this incredible biology, and it's the conservation of this organism is really important. The idea of preserving their habitat, as though they've been pretty adaptive to other types of beaches, cobble beaches. When I worked with the National Park Service, we saw several times the numbers of horseshoe crabs at a high tide would get caught up over a bulkhead, and they put eggs down above the bulkhead. So they're pretty adaptive to surviving, but their habitat is unique and critical, and it's not distributed all over the world. So they're within their range. This is one possible implication to the idea why these animals are being impacted these days. Here's in North America, from Maine, as I said, down to the Yucatan. And then in Asia, there are 3 other species that are found only in Asia, from the Bay of Bengal off of India to Japan and the Korean coast, up to Taiwan, down to Taiwan. They're on the southern portion of the Japanese archipelago, and then down into Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And the Philippine Islands, over 7,000 islands, and they haven't really been surveyed for horseshoe crabs. So there's another part of this story that needs to still be worked on. Now, if paleo survival and the ability to survive in that time wasn't enough to keep these animals protected totally on Earth, there's a conservation message as well. Those 80 to 120,000 eggs that are put down by each female, and the estimate of the number of horseshoe crabs in North America is somewhere in the neighborhood between 4 and 12 million, which means we don't know how many there are. But all of those animals those females are producing eggs for these animals, for the birds. thousands of birds, tens of thousands of birds migrate each year and are in synchrony. This ecological synchronization where they come ashore at the same time to feed on horseshoe crab eggs. And birds like red knots and ruddy turnstones, and red knots are on the endangered species list. They're threatened at this point. The whole idea of these coastal birds migrate along the shoreline to feed on these eggs. This synchrony is an amazing part of the migratory aspects of animals on the planet. And here is a perfect example of it. And truly, this has been going on, again, time immemorial through geological time periods. The evolution of bird species, the evolution of marine mammals, the whole idea of this is still in synchrony with horseshoe crabs. Here's shorebirds, piping plovers, some of them endangered. And literally, it's an amazing scene. If anyone has a chance at any time in their life to get down to Delaware Bay, it's kind of an interesting name for the beach. One is called Slaughter Beach. It's an incredibly massive counting of shorebirds and horseshoe crabs coming ashore there, and you can see some of these pictures. But it's all birds, birds that feed along the shore. And here you can see a congregation, see some of the encrusting organisms on some of these animals, tons of slipper shells all the time in the waterway. And again, this idea of the satellite males competing. Once that first, and you can see the size of the female here and the size of the males, showing this whole idea of the breeding cycle. So at CERCOM, we have monitored, and this dates back to my time in the National Park Service. Gateway National Recreation Area was the first park, literally, on the East Coast to ban the collection of horseshoe crabs within its boundaries. Fire Island has since done that, and so other parks all up and down the East Coast. They're part of the natural resources of Jamaica Bay, and there's a host of history on that alone, but the idea is to monitor. The M in CERCOM is monitoring. Monitoring is critical. You can't talk about changing environments unless you actually collect information about that environment as it goes along. Horseshoe crabs are tagged. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other NGO groups do it. They're constantly being tracked as to where they go and where they move. Again, tremendous site fidelity. They'll find the same animals coming back to the same beaches to breed each year. And they're mixed in with all of the other vertebrates and invertebrates. Here's a single fisheries hall in Jamaica Bay at one site, and just filled with other fish, finfish, and shellfish associated with them. These are their compound eyes, as I mentioned, like insects. They have this visual acuity that is pretty amazing. But here is, again, the third aspect of the importance of horseshoe crabs. Paleohistory, their conservation, and the idea of their blood. They are true blue bloods. The hemocyanin, it's not like our bloods. They are copper-based blood systems. They're instantaneously detecting the ability of bacterial contamination, thus their blood, or an extract from their blood, the amoebocytes, Limulus amoebocyte lysate, is basically detecting endotoxin, detecting bacteria or organisms that produce the idea of certain diseases. And a perfect example of that is gram-negative bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria in your bloodstream, in your breathing and your circulatory system or respiratory system, in any case, is called sepsis, and you don't want that. So every hospital in the United States and every hospital literally in the world has some kind of endotoxin detecting system to determine surgical instruments, injectable drugs, and every medication, every type of even over-the-counter pharmaceutical that you might take, or from vitamins to penicillin or even aspirin. The idea is to detect any particular contamination. And that's what has made the horseshoe crab blood even more important today in the coronavirus pandemic, is to be able to make sure that we're detecting this. And here's just some tiny little bits of information. On the bottom there, medical benefits. LAL and TAL, that's in the Asian crabs. And actually that number is now has changed. It's over $450 million industry. And there are only 4 companies that work on this. And Eli Lilly has just gotten involved with the idea of using somehow the horseshoe crab blood and helping in the detection of and working on the pandemic for COVID-19. In the United States, from 2009 to 2015, there were 3.95 billion medical prescriptions dispensed. That's 3.95 billion individual identifications of whether or not there's contamination in quality control testing. That in itself is significant. The total global number of surgeries has been estimated at over 234 million people or surgeries each year. And each of those surgeries has to make sure that they're sanitary, that there's absolutely no contamination. NASA used LAL in its satellite, when the space shuttle was putting satellites up, it would use it in their clean rooms to make sure that there's no contamination, to give faulty readings on any instrumentation in NASA satellites going up into orbit. And just in the United States, being type 2 diabetic, I can tell you right now, 25.8 million people with diabetes alone, where the insulin has to be injected, LAL is an important part of making sure that there's no contamination there. And then here's the article in the New York Times, which I was kind of glad to see it, but I was also kind of distressed to see it, because primarily horseshoe crabs have been doing their duty, so to speak, with LAL production for 30 or 40 years. This is nothing that is relatively new. So the idea of the pharmacological and pharmaceutical industry revisiting horseshoe crabs is very, very important, and makes it even imperative that we protect these animals into the future. Now,
John, we only have a minute. We only have a minute left.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well,
just let me.
Sure.
What I'd like to add, you're talking about the threat to horseshoe crabs, degradation of the environment, particularly the beaches that they go back to reproduce.
Right.
And then also that they become a delicacy in Asia, and these two issues truly are threatening horseshoe crab.
Yes. I'm going to take it off the share for a minute, and then we can talk about that in the next minute or two. Right.
Yeah.
So, yes, thank you for bringing that up, because losing habitat is certainly significant. If the habitat can be protected, it's one thing. The second thing is that there's a loss, and again, it's not the total loss, but it is a loss. Those 135,000 in New York State that are removed for bait are no longer in the breeding population, and they're actually taking them more and more offshore rather than allowing them to come inshore, put their eggs down in the breeding season, don't harvest them, and then maybe harvest later on. I mean, that's been proposals, but I'd like to see a total ban on the harvesting for bait. And then this is only the last decade or so, maybe a little less than that, maybe about 8 years or so. Certainly, since here we had 2 conferences in Japan and China, and in Asia, these animals are considered a delicacy. They're actually harvested, and there's YouTubes talking about preparing horseshoe crabs or using horseshoe crabs. And in Singapore, on the beach in Singapore during breeding season, 10,000 adults are harvested every day.
Well, Dr. John Tanacredi, thank you for being with us, and thank you for your work. This has been Karl Grossman.